In the fog-draped village of Ironwood, whispers of a centuries-old curse tied to an ancient iron gate have long haunted its residents. Every decade, tragedy strikes, and the gate's shadow looms over the village's secrets. When Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming yet razor-sharp spinster from St. Mary Mead, is summoned by an old friend, she steps into a web of deceit, betrayal, and hidden sins. With her keen eye for human nature and knack for unraveling mysteries, Miss Marple must confront the curse and uncover the truth before another life is claimed. Chapter 1. The Arrival at Ironwood. The train rattled through the misty countryside, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to the unease settling over Miss Jane Marple. She adjusted her shawl, her sharp eyes flicking from the drizzle-streaked window to the letter in her gloved hands. The note, penned in the elegant yet hurried script of her old friend, Lady Beatrice Harrow, had been insistent. "Come to Ironwood at once, Jane. Something is terribly wrong." No further explanation, only a plea and a first-class ticket tucked inside. Miss Marple, never one to ignore a friend's distress or a puzzle, had packed her modest suitcase and boarded the earliest train. As the train slowed, the platform of Ironwood Station came into view, shrouded in a fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. The station was little more than a wooden shelter, its paint peeling, the sign creaking in the damp wind. Miss Marple stepped down, her sensible shoes clicking on the wet stone. A young porter, his cap askew, hurried forward to take her bag, his face pale and eyes darting nervously. "Welcome to Ironwood, Masictum," he mumbled, barely meeting her gaze. "Mind the fog. It sits thicker than usual today." "Thank you, young man," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but laced with curiosity. "Is it always so atmospheric here?" The porter hesitated, glancing toward the village beyond the platform, where indistinct shapes loomed in the mist. "Aye, Maestum. Some say it sits the gate sits doing, keeps the village in its grip." Miss Marple Sip's eyebrows lifted slightly. "The gate." He swallowed, then shook his head. "Best not speak of it. Carriage is waiting for you, Madame. Lady Harrow sent it." Intrigued, Miss Marple followed him to a horse-drawn carriage, its black lacquer gleaming faintly under the gas lamps. The driver, a stooped man with a weathered face, tipped his hat but said nothing as he helped her in. The carriage lurched forward, and soon the village of Ironwood unfolded through the fog, narrow streets lined with crooked stone cottages, their windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. At the village's edge stood a towering iron gate, its intricate bars twisted into shapes that seemed almost alive in the dim light. Miss Marple leaned forward, studying it. The gate marked the entrance to Ironwood Manor, Lady Beatrice's home, but its presence felt heavier, as if it guarded something far older than the estate. The carriage rolled to a stop before the manor's imposing facade, its ivy-clad walls softened by the mist. Lady Beatrice herself stood at the door, her silver hair pinned neatly, though her hands betrayed her nerves, twisting a lace handkerchief. "Jane, thank heaven you sit here," she exclaimed, hurrying down the steps. "I scarcely know where to begin." Miss Marple smiled warmly, patting her friendette's arm. "Then let us begin with tea, Beatrice. Everything is clearer over a cup of tea." Inside, the manor's drawing room was a study in faded grandeur, high ceilings, heavy drapes, and a fire crackling in the hearth. Beatrice poured tea with trembling hands, her eyes flitting to the windows as if expecting something to emerge from the fog. "It's the gate, Jane," she said at last, her voice low. The village calls it cursed. Every 10 years, someone dies, always near that wretched gate. The last was a decade ago. A young man, found cold as stone at its base. And now, the 10th year is upon us. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind racing. A curse, you say? How curious. And what has prompted this urgency? Beatrice. Has something happened? Beatrice leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. 3 nights ago, a scream was heard near the gate. The villagers are terrified, saying the curse is waking. And then there sits the vicar. He's been acting strangely, warning of scenes unpunished. Stets, I fear something dreadful is coming. Miss Marple set her cup down, her eyes gleaming with interest. Tell me about this gate. Who built it? And why do the villagers fear it so? Beatrice hesitated, then began. It's been there for centuries, older than the manor itself. The story goes that it was forged by a blacksmith who made a pact with something dark. He promised the gate would protect Ironwood, but at a cost every decade it demands a life. The villagers believe it's tied to the manor's first family, the Ironwoods, who vanished long ago. Some say their greed brought the curse. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through the tale. And who lives in Ironwood now, besides you? The village is small, but the manor hosts several families of note. Beatrice replied. There's Sir Reginald Vance, a retired colonel with a temper, his daughter Clara, who's secretive and far too clever, and Mr. Thomas Grieve, a solicitor who's been poking into old manor records. Then there's Mrs. Elspeth Morrow, a widow who claims to see things in the fog. They'll all be here tomorrow for tea. I thought you might observe them. An excellent idea, Miss Marple said, her tone mild, but her eyes sharp. People reveal so much when they think no one is watching. A sudden knock at the door made Beatrice start. A maid entered, her face pale. Beg pardon, my lady, but the vicar sets here, says set's urgent. Show him in, Beatrice said, glancing at Miss Marple. The vicar, a thin man with hollow cheeks and feverish eyes, swept into the room. Lady Harrow, Miss Marple, he said, bowing stiffly. I come to warn you. The gate, it stepped stirring. I saw a shadow there last night, moving against the fog. We must act before it steps too late. Miss Marple tilted her head, studying him. A shadow, you say, Mr. Reverend Hale, he supplied, his voice trembling. It was no trick of the light. Something is wrong in Ironwood, and the gate is at its heart. Curious, Miss Marple murmured, her fingers tapping lightly on her saucer. And what do you propose we do, Reverend? He hesitated, his eyes darting to Beatrice. Pray, Miss Marple, and stay away from the gate. As he left, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the door, her mind already weaving connections. The fog, the gate, the vicar's fear. It was all part of a larger tapestry, one she intended to unravel. Beatrice, she said softly, I think I shall enjoy my stay in Ironwood. There's nothing like a good mystery to sharpen the mind. Beatrice managed a weak smile. I knew you'd say that, Jane, but please, be careful. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, I always am. What did you think of Miss Marple's arrival in Ironwood? The mystery of the Iron Gate is just beginning to unfold. Where are you listening this from? Your cozy living room, a bustling cafe, or perhaps a foggy village like Ironwood? Drop your location in the comments below and let us know what you think the curse might be. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for the next chapter and more thrilling tales. Stay curious, and we'll see you at the gate. Chapter 2. The Legend of the Gate. The morning dawned grey and heavy, the fog pressing against the windows of Ironwood Manor like a persistent guest. Miss Jane Marple sat in the breakfast-room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes scanning the faces of the manor's inhabitants as they drifted in. Lady Beatrice Harrow, still pale from the previous night's unsettling visit from the vicar, poured tea with a forced smile. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to such things, found it as intriguing as the fog itself. "Jane, you must try the scones," Beatrice said, her voice a touch too bright. "Mrs. Gibbs, our cook, has a way with them." Miss Marple took a scone, crumbling it delicately between her fingers. "They look delightful, Beatrice, but I confess my mind is elsewhere. Reverend Haleseb's visit last night was most stimulating. I still like to hear more about this gate and its legend." Beatrice's hand faltered, nearly spilling the tea. "Oh, Jane, it's just village superstition. Surely you don't believe in curses." "I believe in what people believe," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but her eyes sharp. "Their fears often point to something real, even if it's not what they imagine. Tell me, who else in Ironwood knows this tale?" Before Beatrice could answer, the door swung open, and Sir Reginald Vance strode in, his military bearing unmistakable despite his advancing years. His face was ruddy, his moustache bristling as he surveyed the room. "Morning, Beatrice. Miss Marple, is it? Heard you're poking about that gate nonsense." Miss Marple inclined her head, unfazed by his brusque tone. "Good morning, Sir Reginald. I take it you not a believer in the curse." "Poppycock," he snorted, dropping into a chair. "Village gossip, nothing more. That gate sits just iron and rust. No need to make a ghost story out of it." "Yet the vicar seemed quite convinced," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but probing. "He spoke of a shadow. Have you ever seen anything unusual near the gate?" Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, his daughter Clara Vance entered. She was a striking young woman, her dark hair pinned tightly, her expression guarded. "Father, you're shouting again," she said, her voice cool. "Miss Marple, don't mind him. He thinks everything's nonsense unless it's in a military manual." Miss Marple smiled faintly, noting the way Staff's fingers tightened around her teacup. "And what do you think of the gate, Miss Vance?" Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window. "It's unsettling. The villagers avoid it, especially at night. They say it hums sometimes, like it sits alive." "Hums?" Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "How curious. Has anyone investigated this?" "Not that I know of," Clara said quickly, then turned to her father. "We stir late for our walk, father. Excuse us." As they left, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Clara's retreating figure. The young woman's unease was palpable, and Miss Marple filed it away, like a stitch in a knitting pattern, to be revisited later. Beatrice sighed, setting down her teapot. "Jane, you still find no shortage of opinions about the gate. Perhaps you should hear the legend properly. Mrs. Elspeth Morrow knows it best. She's lived here longer than most." "An excellent suggestion," Miss Marple said, rising. "Shall we pay her a visit?" The two women set out, the fog curling around their ankles as they walked through Ironwood's cobbled streets. Mrs. Morrow's cottage was a small, ivy-choked affair at the village's edge, its garden wild, with roses that seemed to thrive despite the gloom. The widow herself answered the door, her silver hair braided tightly, her eyes bright with an almost feverish intensity. "Lady Harrow, Miss Marple," she said, ushering them inside. "I heard you stewed come, Miss Marple. Here about the gate, I wager." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a worn armchair. "You sit perceptive, Mrs. I sit like to hear the legend. If you sit, be so kind." Mrs. Morrow's eyes gleamed as she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a storyteller's cadence. The Iron Gate was forged in 1653 by a blacksmith named Elias Ironwood, the manor's first lord. He was a greedy man, they say, obsessed with protecting his wealth. He made a pact with something, some say the devil, others a forest spirit. The gate would guard Ironwood forever, but it demanded a price. Every 10 years, a life must be given. If not, the gate's wrath would consume the village. Miss Marple listened intently, her hands still in her lap. "And what happened to Elias Ironwood?" "Vanished," Mrs. Morrow said, her voice low. "After the first death, a servant found dead at the gate sept's base. Elias was never seen again. His family followed, one by one, until the Ironwoods were gone. The gate stayed, and so did the deaths. Every decade, like clockwork." Beatrice shivered, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Fascinating. And the most recent death, 10 years ago. A young man, Peter Drake," Mrs. Morrow said, "a gardener at the manor. Found at dawn, his face frozen in terror. No marks, no cause, just dead. By the gate." Miss Marple sipped, eyes narrowed slightly. "No marks at all? How peculiar. And what do the villagers believe now?" "They stir scared," Mrs. Morrow said bluntly. "That scream 3 nights ago, it stirred things up. Some say the gate stirred's hungry again." As they spoke, a shadow passed the window, fleeting but unmistakable. Beatrice gasped, but Mrs. Morrow was quicker, rushing to the door and flinging it open. The fog swirled outside, empty. "It sits watching," she whispered, her face pale. Miss Marple rose, her movements calm but deliberate. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrow. You've been most illuminating. Beatrice, perhaps we should return to the manor. I have much to think about." As they stepped back into the fog, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, sifting through the legend's threads. A greedy blacksmith, a vanishing family, a death every decade. There was a pattern here, but not the supernatural one the villagers feared. People, she knew, were far more dangerous than curses, and someone in Ironwood was hiding something. Back at the manor, she paused by the window, gazing out at the Iron Gate sept's silhouette in the distance. Its bars seemed to twist in the fog, almost beckoning. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You have secrets," she murmured, as if addressing the gate itself. "But so do I." Chapter 3. The Vicar Sits Warning. The fog had not lifted by midday, casting Ironwood in a perpetual twilight that seemed to seep into the very walls of the manor. Miss Jane Marple sat in the library, a cosy room lined with dusty tomes and heavy velvet curtains, her knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. The rhythm of her knitting was meditative, but her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of the space. The faded spines of books, the faint smell of old leather, and the nervous fidgeting of Lady Beatrice, who paced near the fireplace. "Jane, you stir too calm," Beatrice said, wringing her hands. "After what Mrs. Morrow told us, and that shadow at her window, I scarcely slept last night." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze gentle but piercing. "My dear Beatrice, fear thrives in the dark. but facts bring light. Well, these a puzzle to solve, and puzzles are best approached with a clear head. Now, tell me, when is the vicar expected? Beatrice glanced at the clock. Any moment now. He sent a note this morning, insisting on speaking with us. He sounded agitated. As if on cue, a sharp knock echoed through the manor. A maid ushered in Reverend Hale, his thin frame wrapped in a black coat that seemed too large for him. His eyes darted about the room, lingering on the windows as if expecting to see the fog itself peering in. "Lady Harrow, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "Thank you for seeing me. I fear I was too abrupt last night." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her smile disarming. "Not at all, Reverend Hale. Your concern for the village is evident. Please, sit. Tell us what troubles you." The vicar perched on the edge of a chair, his hands clasped tightly. "It sits the gate, Miss Marple. I know Sir Reginald scoffs, but I seen things I cannot explain. That shadow I mentioned. It was human. It moved too quickly, too silently." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity. "And where exactly did you see this shadow?" "Near the gate, just after dusk," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was returning from a sick-bed visit in the village. The fog was thick, but I swear it parted for a moment, and there it was, a figure cloaked, standing by the gate. When I called out, it vanished." Beatrice shivered, but Miss Marple Sipt's eyes gleamed with interest. "Vanished, you say? Into the fog or elsewhere?" The vicar hesitated, his fingers twisting together. I don't know. One moment it was there, the next, gone. But it sits, not just the shadow. The gate it hums, Miss Marple. A low, unnatural sound, like a heartbeat. I've heard it myself." "How very intriguing," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her mind racing. "And have others heard this humming?" "Some villagers claim to," he said. "Mrs. Morrow, for one. And young Tommy Grieve, the solicitor's son, swears he heard it last week. The village is on edge, Miss Marple. They believe the curse is waking, and I fear they sit right." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but probing. "You mentioned unpunished sins last night, Reverend. What sins were you referring to?" The vicar Sepp's face paled, and he glanced at Beatrice, as if seeking permission. I spoke out of turn. The village has its secrets, as all villages do. Old grudges, hidden wrongs. The gate seems to stir them up." Miss Marple Sixth's eyes narrowed, but her smile remained. "Secrets are often at the heart of such tales. Perhaps you could share a little more? After all, understanding the past might help us prevent another tragedy." Before the vicar could respond, the library door burst open, and Mr. Thomas Grieve, the solicitor, strode in. His suit was impeccably tailored, but his face was flushed, and his eyes held a glint of irritation. "Reverend, I thought I've find you here, stirring up trouble with your ghost stories." Reverend Hale stiffened. "I am warning them, Grieve, as is my duty. The gate is no mere story. It stets iron and rust, nothing more." Grieve snapped, then turned to Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, I hope you sit, not taken in by this nonsense. Ironwood has enough problems without talk of curses." Miss Marple Sit's expression remained serene. "I find all perspectives valuable, Mr. Grieve. Just a solicitor. I understand you must deal with many of the village Sit's affairs. Have you come across anything unusual in your work? Greave's jaw tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. Hall Fister, nothing worth mentioning, he said curtly. Old deeds, dusty records, that sits my lot. Now, if you settle excuse me, I have business to attend to. As he left, Miss Marple noted the way his hand lingered on the doorframe, as if steadying himself. The vicar meanwhile rose abruptly. I must go as well, he said, his voice strained. Miss Marple, please, heed my warning. Stay away from the gate. He hurried out, leaving Beatrice and Miss Marple alone. Beatrice sank into a chair, her face pale. Jane, what do you make of it? The vicar sits terrified, and Mr. Greave seems angry. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. They're both hiding something, Beatrice. The vicar's fear is genuine, but it's not just the gate he's afraid of. And Mr. Greave, his dismissal was a touch too vehement. I wonder what's in those dusty records he mentioned. Beatrice frowned. Do you think they sit connected to the curse? I think, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling, that curses are often a convenient way to disguise human failings, greed, jealousy, guilt. These are the true shadows in Ironwood. We must simply find out who casts them. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I believe I still take a walk to the church this afternoon. All the vicar's manner suggests he might have left something unsaid. Care to join me? Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. If you think it will help. Oh, it always helps to look a little closer, Miss Marple said, her smile as enigmatic as the fog outside. As they stepped into the hall, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a portrait on the wall, an old painting of a stern man with dark eyes, standing before the iron gate. The plaque read Elias Ironwood, 1653. She paused, studying the face, and for a moment she felt as if the gate itself were watching her, its secrets locked within its twisted bars. Chapter 4. Tea at the Manor. The afternoon tea at Ironwood Manor was a study in contrasts. Delicate china cups gleamed under the chandelier's soft light, yet the air crackled with unspoken tensions. Miss Jane Marple sat near the edge of the drawing-room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes moving from face to face with the quiet alertness of a cat watching a room full of mice. Lady Beatrice Harrow, ever the gracious hostess, poured tea with a practised smile, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. The room was filled with Ironwood's most prominent residents, each one, Miss Marple suspected, holding a piece of the puzzle that was the Iron Gate's curse. Sir Reginald Vance occupied a high-backed chair, his posture rigid, his moustache twitching as he grumbled about the weather. Damned fog, he muttered, stirring his tea with unnecessary vigour. Makes the whole village feel like a blasted graveyard. His daughter, Clara Vance, sat beside him, her dark eyes fixed on her teacup as if it held secrets of its own. She wore a high-necked dress, its severity softened only by a single pearl brooch, and her silence was as pointed as her father's bluster. Across the room Mr. Thomas Greave, the solicitor, stood by the fireplace, his sharp features softened by the firelight, but his expression guarded. He spoke little, though his gaze flicked toward the door whenever a servant passed, as if expecting an interruption. Beside him, Mrs. Elspeth Morrow perched on a velvet settee, her silver braid coiled tightly, her eyes darting to the windows, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her demeanour as unassuming as ever, but her mind was cataloguing every glance, every pause. "What a charming gathering," she said, her voice light. "It's set so rare to see such a close-knit community. You must all know each other. Sets habits quite well." Beatrice smiled, though it didn't set reach her eyes. "Oh yes, Jane. Ironwood is small. Everyone knows everyone Set's business, for better or worse." Mrs. Morrow let out a dry laugh. "For worse more often than not. Secrets done stay buried here, Miss Marple. The gate sees to that." Sir Reginald snorted, slamming his cup onto its saucer. "Not that nonsense again, Elspeth. You still have Miss Marple thinking we start all superstitious fools." "Not fools, Sir Reginald," Mrs. Morrow said sharply. "Cautious. You Sid do well to remember Peter Drake Set's fate, 10 years ago, right at that gate, and no one could explain it." Cludbustet's head snapped up, her fingers tightening around her cup. "Must we discuss that? It's Stet's morbid." Miss Marple, Sid's eyes softened, but her attention sharpened. "I'm sorry to distress you, Miss Vance. Was Peter Drake known to you?" Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering to her father before settling on Miss Marple. "He was a gardener here. A kind boy, but reckless, always poking about where he shouldn't stet." "Reckless?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone gentle but probing. "In what way?" "She means he was nosy," Sir Reginald cut in, his voice gruff, "always asking questions about the manor, the gate, the old families. Got what he deserved, if you ask me." "Reginald," Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "That Sip's a cruel thing to say." "Is it?" Grieve interjected, his voice smooth but edged. "The boy was always rummaging through old records in the village archives. I caught him once, flipping through deeds that were none of his business. Perhaps he stirred up something he shouldn't sit have." Miss Marple, Sit's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Deeds, Mr. Grieve. How interesting. Were these related to the manor, or perhaps the gate itself?" Grieve Sext's expression tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of alarm in his eyes. "Old property records, nothing more," he said curtly. "The Ironwood family left a mess of legal tangles when they vanished. I step in sorting them out for years." "How tedious that must be," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic, but her mind racing. "And yet, such records often hold the key to understanding a place's history. Don't you find that past promises, land, wealth, even curses, have a way of shaping the present?" Grieve's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Mrs. Morrow leaned forward, her voice low and intense. "She's right. The gate's curse isn't just a story. It's tied to the Ironwood's greed. They hoarded wealth, made enemies, and the gate was their reckoning. I've seen it, Miss Marple, shadows moving where no one should be." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint clink of a teaspoon against a saucer. Beatrice cleared her throat, her voice trembling. "Perhaps we should change the subject. Jane, would you like more tea?" Miss Marple smiled, declining with a wave of her hand. "Thank you, Beatrice, but I am quite content." "Mrs. Morrow, you mentioned shadows. Have you seen them recently?" Mrs. Morrow nodded, her eyes gleaming. "3 nights ago, near the gate, the same night as that scream. It was no fox or owl, Miss Marple. It was something else." Clara stood abruptly, her cup rattling in its saucer. "I'm sorry. I need some air." She hurried from the room, her footsteps echoing in the hall. Sir Reginald scowled, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand tightened on his cane. "Nervous girl," he muttered. "Always has been." Miss Marple's gaze followed Clara's path, her mind stitching together the threads of the conversation. Clara's unease, Greaves' defensiveness, Mrs. Morrow's fervour, each was a clue, though the pattern remained elusive. She turned to Sir Reginald, her voice mild. "Your daughter seems troubled. Is she often so affected by talk of the gate?" "She sits young," he said gruffly. "Too much imagination. She's dull grow out of it." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. She turned to Grieve. "And you, Mr. Grieve, have you ever seen these shadows Mrs. Morrow speaks of?" Grieve Sext's lips thinned. "I don't waste my time chasing ghosts, Miss Marple. I deal in facts, contracts, wills, deeds. If their sect's a curse, it sexts the curse of idle gossip." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming. "Gossip can be quite revealing, Mr. Grieve. It sets like knitting. One dropped stitch can unravel the whole pattern." As the tea continued, Miss Marple steered the conversation to lighter topics, but her mind remained on the undercurrents she'd sensed. Clara's sudden departure, Greaves' guardedness, Sir Reginald's bluster, they were all pieces of a larger tapestry, one woven around the iron gate. She resolved to speak with Clara privately. The young woman's reaction suggested she knew more than she was letting on. As the guests began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered by the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded gate in the distance. Its twisted bars seemed to pulse in the dim light, and for a moment she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You're at the heart of this, aren't you?" she murmured, as if addressing the gate itself. "But whose heart is pulling your strings?" She turned back to the room, her smile as serene as ever, but her resolve hardened. The tea had given her much to ponder, and she was determined to find the truth before the gate claimed another victim. Chapter 5. The Shadow in the Fog. The night was thick with fog, a heavy shroud that muffled sound and blurred the edges of Ironwood Manor's sprawling grounds. Miss Jane Marple stood by her bedroom window, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the iron gate. The gas lamps along the manor's drive cast feeble pools of light, barely piercing the mist, and the gate itself seemed to loom larger in the darkness, its twisted bars like skeletal fingers reaching into the night. She had not intended to stay up so late, but the tea gathering earlier that day had left her restless, her mind weaving together the threads of suspicion spun by Clara's unease, Greaves' defensiveness, and Mrs. Morrow's fervent tales. A faint sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic creak, like the gate itself stirring in the wind. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her senses sharpening. She leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass, and then she saw it, a shadow, indistinct but unmistakable, moving near the gate. It was not the steady stride of a villager or the scamper of an animal. It glided almost fluid before vanishing into the fog. "Curious," she murmured, her fingers tightening on her shawl. She glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. A sensible woman might have dismissed the sight as a trick of the light, but Miss Marple was not one to ignore what her eyes told her. She slipped on her coat, tucked her knitting into her bag, and moved quietly down the manor's darkened stairs. The hall was silent, save for the faint tick of a grandfather clock. Miss Marple eased open the front door, wincing at the faint creak, and stepped into the fog. The air was damp and cold, clinging to her skin as she made her way toward the gate, her steps deliberate but soft. The manor's lights faded behind her, swallowed by the mist, and soon she was alone with the gate's looming presence. As she approached, the creaking sound grew louder, though the gate itself stood still, its bars unmoving. She paused, her head tilted, listening. The sound was not mechanical, but almost organic, like a low hum or a distant pulse. She recalled Mrs. Morrow's words about the gate humming, and her lips pursed thoughtfully. Not a curse, she whispered to herself, but something someone wants us to believe is a curse. A sudden rustle in the bushes to her left made her turn, her hand tightening on her bag. "Who's there?" she called, her voice calm but firm. For a moment there was only silence. Then a figure stumbled from the fog, young Tommy Grieve, the solicitor's son, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. "Miss Marple," he gasped, clutching a lantern that swung wildly in his hand. "What are you doing out here?" "I might ask you the same, young man," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but her gaze piercing. "It starts rather late for a stroll." "Done. Stat, you think?" Tommy swallowed, his breath coming in short bursts. I heard something. A scream like the one 3 nights ago. I came to see, thought it was the gate again." Miss Marple Sipt's eyebrows lifted. "And did you see anything?" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the gate. "A shadow!" It moved fast, toward the woods. I tried to follow, but the fog. He trailed off, shivering. "It wasn't set human, Miss Marple. It couldn't set be." She studied him, noting the sweat on his brow, despite the cold. "You star very brave to come out here alone, Tommy. But tell me, have you seen this shadow before?" He shook his head, then paused. "Not seen. But I heard the gate hum last week. I told father. But he said I was imagining things. He sets always saying that." Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her mind was racing. "Fathers often do. Now, let sex get you back to the manor. It's sex far too chilly for either of us to be out here." As they walked back, Tommy Set's lantern casting wavering light through the fog. Miss Marple steered the conversation carefully. "You set's close to your father, Mr. Grieve, I presume? He must rely on you, with all his work on those old records." Tommy shrugged, his expression sullen. "He doesn't tell me much, always locked in his study, going through papers. Says it sups about the manor sept's history, but he gets angry when I ask questions." "Does he? Now," Miss Marple said softly. "And what sort of questions do you ask?" Tommy hesitated, then lowered his voice. "About the Ironwoods, the old family. I found a letter in his desk once, from years ago, mentioning a debt. He caught me reading it, and, well, he wasn't set happy." Miss Marple Sip's eyes gleamed, but her tone remained light. "Young men are often curious. I stoop sure he meant no harm." "What did the letter say?" Tommy shook his head. "I only saw a bit, something about sea repaying what was taken. His dear, then he snatched it away." They reached the manor sept steps, and Miss Marple paused, her hand on the door. "Thank you, Tommy. You sep been most helpful. Now, off to bed. And let's seps keep this little adventure between us, shall we?" He nodded, still shaken, and hurried inside. Miss Marple lingered a moment, her gaze drifting back to the gate, now barely visible in the fog. A debt, a shadow, a humming gate. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though it was still incomplete. She thought of her nephew Raymond's fondness for detective novels, where clues fell neatly into place. Real life, she knew, was messier, but no less revealing if one paid attention. Inside she found Beatrice waiting in the hall, her face pale. "Jane, where have you been?" I heard the door, and feared. "No need to worry, Beatrice," Miss Marple said, patting her friend Set's arm. "I took a little walk to clear my head, but I think we should have a word with Mr. Grieve tomorrow. His work with those records might be more significant than he lets on." Beatrice frowned. "You think he sits involved with the gate?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm, "that someone in Ironwood is stirring up fear for a reason, and I intend to find out why." As she climbed the stairs to her room, her mind returned to the shadow in the fog. It was no ghost, she was certain, but a human hand was at work here, cloaked in the village's fear of the curse. She smiled faintly, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "A clever disguise," she murmured, "but not clever enough." Chapter 6. The Locked Diary. The morning light struggled through the fog, casting a pale glow over Ironwood Manor's library, where Miss Jane Marple sat with a cup of tea and her knitting, her eyes scanning the room with quiet purpose. The events of the previous night, the shadow by the gate, young Tommy Grieve's nervous confession, had only sharpened her resolve. The curse, she was certain, was no supernatural force, but a veil for human misdeeds, and the key to unravelling it lay somewhere within the manor's walls. She had risen early, slipping into the library before breakfast to explore its shelves, suspecting that the answers might be hidden among the dusty volumes or forgotten papers. The library was a cavernous space, its high shelves lined with leather-bound books, their spines cracked with age. A ladder leaned against one wall, and a heavy oak desk stood in the corner, its surface cluttered with ledgers and inkpots. Miss Marple's fingers trailed along the shelves, her touch light but deliberate, as if the books themselves might whisper their secrets. She paused at a section of local histories, her eyes catching on a slim, unmarked volume tucked behind a larger tome on botany. It was bound in faded leather, its edges worn, and when she pulled it free, a faint cloud of dust rose into the air. "How curious," she murmured, turning the book over in her hands. It was not a book at all, but a diary, its cover secured with a small brass lock, now tarnished with age. The lock was flimsy, the kind easily pried open with a hairpin, but Miss Marple hesitated, her sense of propriety warring with her curiosity. "Needs must," she said softly, and with a deft twist of a pin from her hair, the lock clicked open. The diary's pages were brittle, the ink faded, but legible. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, and dated from nearly a century ago. The first entry read the 12th of March, 1847. "The gate hums again tonight, and I fear what it portends. Father swears it is nothing, but I saw the shadow again, watching from the woods. He will not listen, but I know the truth." The signature was simply A. Ironwood. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed as she turned the pages, her mind racing. The diary belonged to an Ironwood, likely a daughter of the family that had vanished so mysteriously. The entries were sporadic, filled with cryptic references to the debt, the pact, and the gate's price. One passage caught her attention. "Father has hidden the deed, but it will not save us. The gate knows what was taken, and it will not rest until it is repaid." She was so absorbed that she didn't hear the door creak open until a sharp voice broke the silence. "Miss Marple, what are you doing?" She turned, her expression serene, to find Clara Vance standing in the doorway, her dark eyes narrowed with suspicion. Clara's hands were clasped tightly, and her posture suggested she had been watching for some time. "Good morning, Miss Vance," Miss Marple said, closing the diary gently but keeping it in her hands. "I was just indulging my love of old books. This library is quite a treasure trove." Clara's gaze flicked to the diary, and her lips tightened. That's not a book. It's private property. You shouldn't be touching it. Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile disarming. Oh, I quite agree, my dear. But old diaries have a way of calling out to those who listen. This one, for instance, seems to have a great deal to say about the Iron Gate. Do you know anything about it? Clara's face paled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might bolt. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice low. You shouldn't meddle, Miss Marple. Some things are better left alone. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. But when people are frightened, as you seem to be, I find it sets often, because the past is not as buried as they like. Were you close to Peter Drake, the gardener who died 10 years ago? Clara flinched, her hands twisting together. Why do you ask that? You seemed distressed at tea yesterday when his name was mentioned, Miss Marple said gently. I thought perhaps you knew him well. He was a friend, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was kind, curious, too curious maybe. He used to talk about the gate, the old stories. He thought there was something hidden in the manor, something valuable. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. Valuable? Did he say what? Clara shook her head, her eyes darting to the diary. He didn't know, just said he'd found papers in the archives, something about the Ironwoods. He wanted to tell me more. But then, her voice broke, and she turned away. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice soft but probing. But then he died. At the gate. Did anyone else know about these papers? I don't know, Clara said, her voice trembling. I told him to stop looking, but he wouldn't listen, and now you digging, just like he did. Before Miss Marple could respond, footsteps echoed in the hall, and Mr. Thomas Grieve appeared, his sharp features drawn with irritation. Clara, your father sits looking for you. And Miss Marple, I hope you said not troubling our guests with your inquiries. Not at all, Mr. Grieve, Miss Marple said, slipping the diary into her bag with a deft movement. I was just admiring the library. You must spend a great deal of time here, with all your work on those old records. Grieve's eyes narrowed, but he forced a smile. It's tedious work, nothing more. Now, if you still excuse us, Clara has duties to attend to. As they left, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the doorway. Clara's fear and Grieve's defensiveness were threads in the same tapestry, and the diary was a new stitch, one that pointed to a scandal buried in the Ironwood family's past. She resolved to read more of it in private, but first she needed to speak with Beatrice about the manor's archives. If Peter Drake had found something there, and if Grieve was as involved as his son suggested, those records might hold the key to the gate's so-called curse. She made her way to the drawing room, where Beatrice was arranging flowers, her hands trembling slightly. Jane, you look thoughtful, Beatrice said, glancing up. Have you found something? Only the beginnings of something, Miss Marple said, her smile enigmatic. Beatrice, tell me, does the manor keep old family papers, deeds, letters, that sort of thing? Beatrice nodded. In the attic, I believe. Mr. Grieve has been cataloguing them, though. He sets very particular about who sees them. Is he now? Miss Marple said softly. I think I like to take a look. With your permission, of course. Old papers can be so illuminating. Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. It's still arrange it. But Jane, be careful. I don't like the way Mr. Grieve has been acting lately. Oh, I'm always careful, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. But as she glanced toward the window, where the iron gate's silhouette loomed in the fog, she felt a prickle of unease. The diary's words echoed in her mind. The gate knows what was taken. Whatever had been taken, she was determined to find it, and the person who was so desperate to keep it hidden. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Churchyard. The afternoon was cloaked in the same relentless fog that had haunted Ironwood since Miss Jane Marple's arrival, its tendrils curling around the village's ancient church like a jealous lover. Miss Marple, her shawl tucked tightly against the damp chill, made her way along the cobblestone path to St. Cuthbert's, her steps deliberate but silent. The diary she had found in the library weighed heavily in her bag, its cryptic entries about debts and pacts fueling her determination to uncover more. Beatrice had promised to arrange access to the manor's attic archives, but Miss Marple's instincts told her that the church, with its vicar's nervous warnings and its proximity to the iron gate, held secrets of its own. The churchyard was a maze of weathered gravestones, their inscriptions softened by time and moss. The iron gate loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the mist, yet its presence seemed to pulse with an unspoken menace. Miss Marple paused by a yew tree, its gnarled branches offering a sliver of cover, and adjusted her hat, her eyes scanning the churchyard for any sign of movement. She had hoped to find Reverend Hale, whose fear of the gate seemed rooted in more than superstition, but the church appeared deserted, its heavy oak door shut tight. As she moved closer, a low murmur of voices reached her ears, carried on the damp air. She froze, her senses sharpening, and slipped behind a tall gravestone, her small frame blending into the shadows. The voices were coming from the far side of the churchyard, near a cluster of older tombs. Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. Eavesdropping was not her habit, but as her dear friend Dolly Bantry often said, one must occasionally bend propriety to uncover the truth. The voices grew clearer as she crept closer, careful to avoid the crunch of gravel underfoot. She recognized the sharp, clipped tones of Mr. Thomas Grieve, the solicitor, and another voice, higher, unsteady, but unmistakably clairvoyant. "Eustache, a fool! If you think you can keep this quiet," Grieve was saying, his voice low but laced with venom. "You know what sits at stake, Clara. If those papers surface, it sits over for all of us." Clara Sixth's reply was sharp, but her voice trembled. "Done sit lecture me. Thomas did ask for this. You promised it was buried, that no one would find out. But now, with her poking around." Miss Marple. Grieve Sept's tone was scathing. "A nosy old spinster. She sit'll find nothing but dust and ghost stories." Miss Marple Sit's eyes twinkled faintly, but she remained still, her breath steady. Clapple Sit's voice dropped to a whisper, forcing Miss Marple to strain to hear. "Shestert's not like the others, Thomas. Shestert's already found the diary. What if she gets to the attic? Or worse, the gate?" Grieve Sept's response was a hiss. "Then we make sure she doesn't stet." Peter Drake got too close. And look what happened to him. We can afford another mistake. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her bag, the mention of Peter Drake sending a chill down her spine. The diary's cryptic warnings, Tommy's talk of a debt, and now this, a conversation that hinted at murder. She leaned forward, her heart steady, but her mind racing, as Clara spoke again. "I didn't want him dead," she said, her voice breaking. "I loved him, Thomas. You swore it was an accident." "It was," Grieve snapped, but his tone lacked conviction. "The gate took him, just like the stories say. Don't complicate things, Clara. Keep your mouth shut, and we shall be fine." Their voices faded, As they moved away, their footsteps swallowed by the fog. Miss Marple waited, her mind stitching together the fragments of what she'd heard. Clara's grief, Greaves' threats, the mention of papers and Peter Drake's death. It was a pattern, one that pointed to a motive far more tangible than a curse. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a whispered conversation in a garden had unravelled a web of blackmail. People, she knew, were careless when they thought no one was listening. She stepped out from behind the gravestone, her expression serene, but her resolve hardened. The church door creaked open, and Reverend Hale appeared, his thin face pale, and his eyes wide with alarm. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, clutching a prayer book. "What are you doing out here? The churchyard's no place to linger, not with the gate so near." Miss Marple smiled, her tone gentle but probing. "I was admiring the gravestones, Reverend. They tell such stories, don't they? I wonder, have you ever noticed anything unusual in the churchyard at night?" Helsip's hands trembled, and he glanced toward the gate. "Unusual? Sep told you about the shadow, but Sep's enough to keep me inside after dark. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just an old woman sits curiosity," she said lightly. "But I couldn't help noticing how close the church is to the gate. You must hear things, humming perhaps, or voices." The vicar's face tightened, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. "Voices," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hear prayers, Miss Marple, and the cries of a village in fear. If you heard voices, perhaps you should leave them be." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, but her smile remained. "Perhaps, but fear has a way of making people talk, Reverend. And talk, I find, often leads to truth." Hale swallowed, then turned back to the church. "I must prepare for evening service. Please, Miss Marple, stay away from the gate, for your own safety." As he disappeared inside, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the gate, its iron bars glinting faintly in the fog. Greaves' words echoed in her mind. Peter Drake got too close. Too close to what? She wondered. A secret, a debt, or something buried in those attic papers. She thought of the diary, with its talk of a debt and a pact, and resolved to read more that evening. But first she needed to speak with Clara again. The young woman's grief was genuine, but her silence was protecting someone, perhaps even herself. She made her way back to the manor, the fog swirling around her like a conspirator. As she passed the gate, she paused, her eyes tracing its intricate patterns. "You stir no curse," she murmured, as if addressing it directly. "But you stir a very convenient excuse." Back in her room, she locked the door and opened the diary, her fingers lingering on the page about the deed and the gate's price. The churchyard conversation had given her a new thread to follow, and she was determined to pull it until the entire tapestry unravelled. Someone in Ironwood had killed Peter Drake, and the gate was their shield. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. "Not for long," she said to herself, her voice as calm as the fog outside. Chapter 8. The Missing Heirloom. The morning brought no relief from the fog that clung to Ironwood, its grey veil softening the manor's sharp edges, but doing little to ease the growing tension within its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the breakfast room, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the strained faces around the table. Lady Beatrice Harrow was paler than usual, her hands fluttering over the silver teapot, as if seeking comfort in routine. The overheard conversation in the churchyard had given Miss Marple much to ponder: Clara's grief, Greaves' threats, and the shadow of Peter Drake's death. But before she could pursue her next move, a commotion erupted in the hall. The door burst open, and Sir Reginald Vance stormed in, his face a thundercloud. "It's gone," he bellowed, his moustache quivering with rage. "The ironwood locket, stolen, right from my study." Beatrice gasped, her teacup clattering against its saucer. "Stolen? Reginald, are you certain?" "Of course I said I'm certain," he snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "I checked this morning. All the case was empty. The lock forced. Someone in this house is a thief." Miss Marple Sue's eyes gleamed with interest, though her expression remained serene. "A locket, Sir Reginald? How intriguing. Might you describe it?" Sir Reginald turned to her, his anger barely contained. "Gold engraved with the Ironwood crest, a gate with ivy. Its set's been in the family for generations, priceless, and now its set's gone, thanks to some light-fingered scoundrel." Clara Vance, who had entered quietly behind her father, stood frozen, her face pale. "Father, please, don't make a scene. Perhaps you misplaced it." "Misplaced?" he roared. "I know where I keep my valuables, girl. This is no accident." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice gentle but probing. "And when did you last see it, Sir Reginald? And who else knew where it was kept?" He glared at her, but his tone softened slightly, as if sensing her calm authority. "Last night, before dinner, I checked it, as I always do. Only Clara and I knew where it was, locked in my study desk. The servants have no business there." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to Clara, noting the young woman Sip's tightly clasped hands. "And you, Miss Vance, did you see the locket yesterday?" Clue spars darted to her father. Then away. "Yes, I saw it when father showed it to me, but I didn't touch it." Beatrice intervened, her voice trembling. "Jane, this is dreadful. First the gate, now this. Do you think it's set, connected?" "It's all possible," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "In my experience, theft often follows secrets. Sir Reginald, might I see the study? Sometimes the smallest detail can reveal much." Grumbling, Sir Reginald led the way, with Beatrice, Clara, and Miss Marple following. The study was a masculine domain of dark wood and leather, its desk cluttered with papers and a brass inkstand. The lock on the drawer was indeed forced, its edges splintered. Miss Marple bent to examine it, her fingers tracing the damage. "A crude job," she murmured. "Not the work of a practiced thief, but someone in a hurry." She straightened, her eyes scanning the room. A small portrait hung above the desk, a stern woman in a high-necked gown, her hand resting on a familiar object, the iron gate. The plaque read Margaret Ironwood, 1847. Miss Marple's mind flashed to the diary, signed A. Ironwood, and its cryptic mention of a deed and a debt. Could the locket be tied to the same scandal? "Sir Reginald," she said, turning to him, "this locket, did it have any particular significance beyond its value?" He frowned, his anger giving way to unease. "It's an heirloom, passed down from the Ironwoods. They say it was made the same year as the gate, by Elias Ironwood himself. There sits a legend. It holds a secret, but its sit's never been opened." Miss Marple Sip's eyebrows lifted. "Sealed? How curious. And no one tried to open it?" "Not that I know of," he said gruffly. "It's a family relic, not a toy." Clara shifted uncomfortably, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided the portrait. Before she could press further, Mr. Thomas Grieve entered, his sharp features drawn with irritation. "What's all this about a theft?" he demanded. "Reginald, you're making enough noise to wake the dead, are ye?" "It's such the locket," Beatrice said, her voice tight. "It's such been stolen from Reginald's set study." Greaves's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of alarm. "Stolen? That Sip's unfortunate. Any suspects?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her gaze sharp. "But I wonder, Mr. Grieve, have you come across any mention of this locket in your work with the Manor Sip's records? You seem so thorough in your research." Greaves's jaw tightened. "I deal in deeds, not trinkets, Miss Marple. If you sit'll excuse me, I have work to do." As he left, Miss Marple's mind raced. The locket, the diary, the gate, each was a piece of a puzzle that pointed to the Ironwood family's past. She recalled Clara's words in the churchyard, her fear that Miss Marple was digging just like Peter Drake. Had Peter been searching for the locket, or its secret, and had someone ensured he never found it? She turned to Beatrice. "Might I speak with the servants? They often notice things we overlook." Beatrice nodded, and soon a nervous maid, Jenny, was brought in. She twisted her apron as she spoke. "I don't know nothing, Marston, honest. But I did see Miss Clara near the study last night, late. She looked upset, like she'd been crying." Clara's face flushed, but before she could speak, Sir Reginald rounded on her. "Clara, what were you doing in my study?" "I wasn't sit," Clara cried, her voice breaking. I couldn't sit sleep, so I walked the halls. I didn't sit go in." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "No need to distress yourself, my dear. Jenny, did you see anyone else near the study?" The maid hesitated, then shook her head. "No, Maid Teastrom, but I heard the gate humming last night, same as always when something bad happens." Sir Reginald scoffed, but Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Thank you, Jenny. That's most helpful." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the study, her gaze returning to the portrait of Margaret Ironwood. The locket, the gate, the diary's talk of a debt. It was all connected, she was certain. Someone in Ironwood had taken the locket, perhaps to protect its secret, or to use it for their own ends. She thought of Greaves's defensiveness, Clara's tears, and the shadow in the fog. The curse was no supernatural force, but a human one, and the locket was its latest thread. She slipped back to her room, the diary still in her bag. Tonight she would read more, and tomorrow she would visit the attic archives. The locket's theft was no coincidence, and she was determined to find out who had taken it, and why the gate's shadow seemed to follow their every move. Chapter 9. The Night of the Storm. The storm descended on Ironwood with a fury that seemed to echo the village's mounting unease. By late afternoon, the fog had thickened into a roiling mass, and dark clouds churned overhead, unleashing torrents of rain that battered the manor's windows. Miss Jane Marple stood in the drawing-room, her knitting needle silent in her lap, her eyes fixed on the tempest outside. The iron gate, barely visible through the downpour, swayed slightly in the wind, its bars glinting like wet iron teeth. The theft of the Ironwood locket, Clara's evasions, and the cryptic diary entries weighed heavily on her mind, but the storm's arrival felt like a turning point, as if the village itself were bracing for a reckoning. Lady Beatrice Harrow paced before the fireplace, her hands twisting a damp handkerchief. "This storm, Jane, it's that's unnatural. The villagers are saying it's that's the gate that's doing, that it's that's angry about the locket." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. Villagers often see omens in the weather, Beatrice, but I suspect our thief is more concerned with earthly matters than supernatural ones. Have the servants searched the manor for the locket? Beatrice nodded. Everywhere, but it sits gone. Sir Reginald is furious, and Clara Sit's been locked in her room all day. She won't speak to anyone. Before Miss Marple could reply, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and a distant scream pierced the air, sharp and fleeting. Beatrice froze, her face paling. "Jane, did you hear that?" Miss Marple rose, her movements calm but deliberate. "I did. It came from outside, near the gate, I think. We must investigate." Beatrice clutched her arm. "In this storm. That's madness. The gate is iron and rust," Miss Marple said firmly, echoing Sir Reginald Sep's words but with a different intent. "And screams are made by people, not curses. Fetch your coat, Beatrice." Reluctantly, Beatrice complied, and the two women ventured into the hall, where they found Sir Reginald, Mr. Grieve, and Mrs. Morrow already gathered, in their faces taut with alarm. A young footman, soaked to the bone, burst through the front door, his eyes wide with panic. "It's Tommy," he gasped. "Tommy Grieve. He's dead. By the gate." Mr. Grieve-Sip's face drained of colour, and he staggered, clutching the banister. "My boy? No. It can Sipt be. Where is he?" The footman pointed toward the gate, his voice trembling. "Found him just now, sir. Lying there, no marks, just gone. Like Peter Drake." Miss Marple Sit's heart sank, but her mind sharpened. "Show us," she said, her voice steady. And quickly, before the rain washes away any clues. The group braved the storm, their lanterns flickering in the wind as they trudged toward the gate. The rain stung their faces, and the wind howled, making conversation nearly impossible. Miss Marple, her shawl sodden, but her resolve unshaken, kept pace with the others, her eyes scanning the ground. The gate loomed ahead, its bars slick and gleaming, and there, at its base, lay young Tommy Grieve, his body still, his face frozen in a mask of terror. Mrs. Morrow let out a choked sob, crossing herself. "The curse! It's taken another." Sir Reginald knelt beside the boy, his hands shaking as he checked for a pulse. "He sits gone," he said gruffly, his voice breaking, just like the stories. Mr. Grieve fell to his knees, a guttural cry escaping him. "Tommy, my boy, why were you out here?" Miss Marple crouched beside the body, her eyes moving over Tommy's face, his hands, his clothes. There were no visible wounds, no blood, but his coat was torn at the shoulder, and his lantern lay shattered nearby. She reached into his pocket, her fingers brushing against a crumpled piece of paper. Carefully, she unfolded it, shielding it from the rain. It was a note, scrawled in haste, "Meet me at the gate, midnight. We need to talk about the locket." She slipped the note into her bag, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Grieve," she said gently, "did Tommy mention anything unusual today? About the locket, perhaps?" Grieve-Sit's head snapped up, his eyes wild with grief and suspicion. "The locket. What do you know about it, Miss Marple?" "Only that it's missing," she said, her tone calm but probing, "and that Tommy was curious about your work with the Manassets records. Did he ever speak of a meeting, or someone he trusted?" Grieve shook his head, his voice hoarse. He was always asking questions, poking into things. I told him to leave it alone, but he wouldn't listen. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the gate, its hum faintly audible even over the storm's roar. She recalled the diary's words, The gate knows what was taken. Tommy's death was no accident, she was certain, and the note suggested he had been lured here, but by whom? And why? We must get him inside, she said, rising, and call the constable, though this storm may delay him. Sir Reginald, can you help? Sir Reginald nodded, his face grim as he and the footman lifted Tommy's body. As they carried him back to the manor, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the ground near the gate. A glint in the mud caught her attention, a small gold object, half buried. She knelt, ignoring the rain soaking her knees, and retrieved it. It was the ironwood locket, its engraved gate gleaming faintly, its clasp still sealed. She tucked it into her bag, her mind racing. The locket's presence here was no coincidence. Someone had dropped it, perhaps in panic. After Tommy's death, she thought of Clara's tears, Greaves' threats, and the shadow in the fog. The pieces were falling into place, but the pattern was still incomplete. Back at the manor, the group gathered in the drawing-room, their faces drawn with shock. Clara stood in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not him, too." Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way her gaze darted to her father, then away. "Miss Vance," she said softly, "did you know Tommy was going to the gate tonight?" Clara shook her head, but her eyes betrayed her. "No, I told him to stay away. He was always so curious, like Peter." Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. "Curiosity can be dangerous," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "but so can silence. If you know something, my dear, now is the time to speak." Clara turned away, her shoulders shaking, and Miss Marple let her go, knowing pressure would only deepen her fear. She turned to Beatrice. "We must secure the manor tonight. No one should go near the gate until the constable arrives." Beatrice nodded, her face pale. "Jane, do you think the curse—" "There is no curse," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Only people, and their secrets, and I intend to uncover them." As the storm raged on, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the locket and the note hidden in her bag, her mind weaving together the threads of the mystery. Tommy's death had raised the stakes, and the locket's recovery was a new clue, one that pointed to a killer hiding among them. She would need to tread carefully, but she was no stranger to danger. The gate might hum, but it was human hands that had struck tonight, and she was determined to find them. Chapter 10. Secrets in the Attic. The storm had subsided by morning, leaving Ironwood shrouded in a damp, uneasy calm. The manor's halls were quiet, the air heavy with grief and suspicion after young Tommy Greaves' death at the gate. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, the ironwood locket and Tommy's cryptic note safely hidden in her knitting bag, alongside the diary of A. Ironwood. The locket's recovery at the scene of Tommy's death, coupled with the note's mention of a midnight meeting, had sharpened her focus. The curse was no supernatural force, she was certain, but a carefully crafted illusion masking a human crime. To unravel it, she needed to delve deeper into the manor's past, and the attic archives, as Beatrice had promised, were her next step. After breakfast, Miss Marple found Beatrice in the drawing-room, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Jane, the constable's sic's been delayed by flooded roads," Beatrice said, her voice trembling. "And Mr. Greaves is beside himself. He locked himself in his study." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "Grief can close doors, Beatrice, but it can also open them. I'd like to see those attic records now, if you please." They may shed light on Tommy Sit's death and the locket." Beatrice nodded, though her hands twisted nervously. "I still take you up. But Jane, be careful. Mr. Grieve was furious when I mentioned you wanted access. He says the records are his domain." "Does he now?" Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her eyes gleaming. "Then we shall be discreet." The attic was reached by a narrow staircase, its steps creaking underfoot. Beatrice carried a lantern, its light casting long shadows across the dusty beams. The attic itself was a cavern of forgotten relics, trunks stuffed with moth-eaten clothes, cracked mirrors, and stacks of yellowed papers tied with faded ribbon. A single window, grimy with age, let in a sliver of grey light, illuminating a desk piled high with ledgers and documents. "This is where Mr. Grieve works," Beatrice said, setting the lantern down. "His Sit's been cataloguing the Ironwood family Sit's papers for years." Miss Marple Stip's fingers trailed over a stack of deeds, her touch light but purposeful. "A daunting task," she said, her voice thoughtful, "and one that might uncover secrets some would prefer to keep buried." She began sifting through the papers, her eyes scanning faded ink and brittle parchment. Most were mundane, land transfers, tax records, but one bundle, tucked beneath a heavy ledger, caught her attention. It was a collection of letters, their wax seals broken, addressed to Margaret Ironwood, dated 1847, the same year as the diary. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she unfolded the first, its ink still legible. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "your father's greed will destroy us all. The Gates pact was a mistake, and the debt must be paid. I beg you, return what was taken, or the curse will claim another." The signature was smudged, but the initials J.H. were clear. Miss Marple Sit's lips pursed thoughtfully. "J.H., she murmured. "Could that be a Hale, perhaps? The Vicar Sit's family has deep roots here." "I understand." Beatrice frowned, peering over her shoulder. "Reverend Hale's Sit's grandfather, perhaps. The Hales have been vicars in Ironwood for generations." Before Miss Marple could reply, a floorboard creaked behind them. She turned to find Clara Vance standing in the doorway, her face pale and her hands clenched. "What are you doing up here?" Clara asked, her voice sharp with unease. Miss Marple smiled, unfazed. "Just indulging my curiosity, Miss Vance. These old papers are so fascinating. Have you ever looked through them?" Clara Sip's eyes darted to the letters in Miss Marple Sip's hand. "No, they Sips a Mr. Grieve Sip's business. You shouldn't stipt be touching them." "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. "But when a young man like Tommy dies, and a locket goes missing, one must look everywhere for answers. Did Tommy ever mention these papers to you?" Clara Sit's face tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of fear. He said he found something. A letter about the gate. He thought it was important, but he wouldn't tell me more." Miss Marple Sit's eyebrows lifted. "A letter? How curious. And did he say where he found it?" Clara shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was scared, Miss Marple. He said someone was watching him, following him. I told him to stop, but he wouldn't set." Before Miss Marple could press further, heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs, and Mr. Grieve appeared, his face flushed with anger. "What is this?" "Lady Harrow, I told you these records are private." Beatrice shrank back, but Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Grieve, a boy is dead, and a locket is missing. These papers may hold clues to both. Surely you want justice for your son." Greaves' jaw clenched, and his eyes flicked to the letters in Miss Marple's hand. "Those are irrelevant, old family squabbles, nothing more. Usurped, wasting your time." "Are they?" Miss Marple said, holding his gaze. "This letter mentions a debt and a pact, much like the diary I found. And Tommy was curious about such things, wasn't he?" Greaves' face darkened, but before he could respond, a gust of wind rattled the attic window, and the lantern flickered. Clara gasped, and even Greaves seemed unnerved. Miss Marple, however, remained steady, her mind racing. The letter's mention of a debt and a pact echoed the diary, and Tommy's death suggested he had stumbled onto something dangerous. She thought of the locket, its sealed clasp hiding a secret, and the note in Tommy's pocket, luring him to the gate. "I think we disturbed you enough, Mr. Greave," Miss Marple said, slipping the letters into her bag with a deft movement. "But I wonder, have you ever come across a locket in these records, one with a sealed clasp, perhaps?" Greaves' eyes narrowed, but he shook his head. "No, wholly. And I advise you to leave this alone, Miss Marple. Curiosity can be dangerous." "So I've heard," she said, her smile enigmatic, "but I find it's often the only way to uncover the truth." As they descended the stairs, Miss Marple's thoughts were on the letters and the locket. The Ironwood family's tragedy, a debt unpaid, a pact with the gate, was at the heart of the mystery, and someone in the manor was desperate to keep it buried. She recalled the churchyard conversation, Greaves' threat that Peter Drake got too close. Tommy, it seemed, had followed the same path and paid the same price. In her room, she locked the door and opened the letters, her fingers lingering on the initials, J.H. the vicar's fear, Clara's grief, Greaves' anger. All were threads in a tapestry woven around the gate. She would need to speak with Reverend Hale again, and soon, but first, she would examine the locket more closely. Its secret, she suspected, was the key to the curse, and the killer hiding behind it. Chapter 11. The Confession. The fog had settled into a heavy mist by evening, cloaking Ironwood Manor in a silence broken only by the occasional drip of rainwater from the eaves. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with their usual steady rhythm, though her eyes were fixed on the ironwood locket, now resting on the table before her. Its gold surface gleamed faintly in the lamplight, the engraved gate motif seeming to pulse with secrets. The letters from the attic, the diary, and Tommy Greaves' note were tucked safely in her bag, each a thread in the tapestry of deceit she was unraveling. Tommy's death, the stolen locket, and the cryptic references to a debt and a pact pointed to a human hand behind the gate's so-called curse, and Miss Marple was determined to expose it. Lady Beatrice Harrow entered, her face pale and drawn. "Jane, the constable still hasn't arrived," she said, her voice trembling. "The roads are impassable, and Mr. Greave is refusing to speak to anyone. Clara's been in her room all day, and Sir Reginald is threatening to search every servant's quarters for the locket." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze thoughtful. "The locket has been found, Beatrice, though I not yet shared that fact. I suspect its theft was meant to distract us from something far more serious." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Found? Where? And why haven't you told anyone?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but enigmatic. "Patience, my dear. I found it near the gate, where Tommy was discovered. But I need to understand its significance before we proceed. I'd like to speak with Clara, if she sits willing." Her silence is telling. Don't sit, you think. Before Beatrice could respond, a soft knock sounded at the door, and Clara Vance entered, her face blotchy with tears. Her hands were clasped tightly, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you." Beatrice hesitated, but Miss Marple nodded. "Of course, Beatrice, if you said give us a moment." As Beatrice left, Clara sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking. "I can sit keep it in any longer," she said, her voice breaking. "It's my fault. Tommy Sid's death, the locket, all of it." Miss Marple Sixth's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "My dear, take your time. Tell me what you mean." Clara drew a shuddering breath, her words tumbling out. "I took the locket from Father's study. I didn't mean any harm. I just wanted to know if it was true, what Peter Drake told me years ago. He said the locket held a secret, something about the Ironwoods and the gate. I thought, if I could open it, I could understand why he died." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. "And did you open it?" Clara shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I couldn't. The clasp is sealed, like Father said. But Tommy saw me with it. He was curious, always asking questions, like Peter. He followed me to the gate last night. I didn't know he'd be there. I dropped the locket when I heard the scream. And then I found him, dead." Miss Marple Sixth's gaze narrowed, though her expression remained kind. "You were at the gate when Tommy died? Did you see anyone else?" Clara Sixth's hands twisted in her lap. "No, it was too dark, too foggy. But I heard the gate humming, and I felt something watching me. I ran back to the manor, terrified. I didn't mean for him to die, Miss Marple. I just wanted answers." Miss Marple reached out, patting Clara Sixth's hand. "I believe you, my dear. But tell me, why did you take the locket in secret? Why not ask your father?" Clara Sixth's eyes dropped to the floor. "Because I thought he might be hiding something. He sits always so angry when anyone mentions the gate or the Ironwoods, and Peter. When he died, Father said he deserved it, that he was meddling. I couldn't trust him." Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. Clara's confession explained the locket's theft, but it raised more questions than it answered. The note in Tommy's pocket, "Meet me at the gate, midnight," suggested he had been lured there, but Clara claimed it was a chance encounter. And the locket's sealed clasp hinted at a secret someone was desperate to protect. Before she could press further, the door opened, and Sir Reginald Vance strode in, his face red with fury. "Clara, what's this I hear about you skulking about? Have you been talking nonsense to Miss Marple?" Clara flinched, but Miss Marple rose, her voice calm but firm. "Sir Reginald, your daughter is understandably upset. Stex told me about the locket, and I believe her intentions were innocent. But I wonder, have you ever tried to open the locket yourself?" Sir Reginald Sipt's eyes narrowed, his moustache twitching. "What's that got to do with anything? It's a family heirloom, sealed for generations. No one opened it, and no one needs to." Miss Marple Stu's smile was serene, but her mind was racing. "Curious. Don't start, you think? A locket that can be opened, tied to a gate that hums and a family that vanished. I found it near Tommy Sepp's body, Sir Reginald. Someone dropped it there, perhaps in haste." Sir Reginald Sit's face paled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of fear. "Near Tommy? That's impossible. I locked it away myself." Yet it was stolen, Miss Marple said, her tone mild but pointed, and now a boy is dead. I think it's time we all spoke plainly. Down set you. Before Sir Reginald could respond, Mr. Grieve entered, his sharp features drawn with grief and suspicion. "What sits this about the locket?" he demanded, his eyes flicking to Clara. "Have you been meddling, girl?" Clara shrank back, but Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice steady. "Mr. Grieve, Clara has confessed to taking the locket, but I suspect there slips more to this story. Your son was investigating the Ironwood papers, wasn't he? And he met someone at the gate last night. Do you know who?" Grieve's jaw tightened, and his voice was cold. "My son was a fool, poking into things that didn't concern him. If he was at the gate, it was his own doing." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Perhaps, but the note in his pocket suggests otherwise. Someone wanted him there, Mr. Grieve, and I intend to find out who." The room fell silent, the tension thick as the fog outside. Clara's confession had shed light on the locket's theft, but Miss Marple sensed a deeper deception at play. The note, the locket, the diary, and the letters all pointed to a secret buried in the Ironwood family's past, one that someone was willing to kill to protect. She thought of the churchyard conversation, Grieve's threat about Peter Drake, and Clara's fear. The killer was close, hiding behind the gate's curse, and Miss Marple was determined to draw them out. She picked up the locket, its weight heavy in her hand. "This holds the key," she said softly, almost to herself, "and I shall find a way to open it." Chapter 12. The Gathering. At the Gate. The evening was heavy with mist, the air thick with the scent of damp earth, as Miss Jane Marple stood in the drawing-room of Ironwood Manor, her knitting bag at her side, and the ironwood locket clutched in her hand. The events of the past days, Clara's confession, Tommy's death, the cryptic diary, and the attic letters had woven a tapestry of deceit, and she was certain the iron gate held the key to its unravelling. The constable was still delayed by flooded roads, and the villagers' fear of the curse had reached a fever pitch. Miss Marple, however, saw not a curse but a carefully orchestrated crime, and she was ready to pull the final thread. She turned to Lady Beatrice Harrow, who stood by the fireplace, her face pale but resolute. "Beatrice, I stood like you to gather everyone at the gate tonight, Sir Reginald, Clara, Mr. Grieve, Mrs. Morrow, and Reverend Hale. Tell them I have news about the locket and Tommy Sipt's death." Beatrice's eyes widened. "At the gate, Jane, in the dark, with all this talk of the curse, they still think you set mad." Miss Marple's smile was serene but firm. "Perhaps, but fear has a way of loosening tongues, and I believe the truth is waiting at that gate. Will you do it?" Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. "I still send the invitations. But Jane, what are you planning?" "Only to bring things into the open," Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming. "Now, if you excuse me, I have one small task to attend to." She retired to her room, where she examined the locket closely, its sealed clasp unyielding under her fingers. The diary's words echoed in her mind. "The gate knows what was taken." She had spent the afternoon studying the locket, and with a hairpin and a steady hand, she had finally pried it open, revealing a tiny folded paper inside. It was a fragment of a deed, dated 1653, promising a vast sum to a J. Hale, in exchange for silence about the Ironwood Pact. The initials matched the attic letters, and Miss Marple's suspicions about the vicar's family deepened. She tucked the paper back into the locket, her plan taking shape. At 9 o'clock, the group gathered at the iron gate, their lanterns casting wavering light through the mist. Sir Reginald Vance stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of irritation. "This is nonsense, Miss Marple," he growled, "dragging us out here in the cold to chase ghost stories." Clara stood beside him, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands clasped tightly. Mr. Grieve was silent, his sharp features drawn with grief and suspicion, while Mrs. Morrow clutched a shawl, her eyes darting to the gate's twisted bars. Reverend Hale lingered at the edge, his prayer-book clutched like a shield, his face pale. Miss Marple stepped forward, the locket gleaming in her hand. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice calm but carrying in the still air. "The gate has been blamed for much. Peter Drake's death, Tommy's death, the fear that grips this village, but I believe the truth is far simpler and far more human." Mrs. Morrow gasped, crossing herself. "The curse, Miss Marple. That's real. You've seen the deaths." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone was firm. "I've seen deaths, Mrs. Morrow, but not curses. Let us start with the locket." She held it up, its gold catching the lantern light. "Clara, you took it, hoping to uncover its secret, but someone else wanted it, didn't they? Someone who knew what it contained." Clara's face crumpled, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her gaze moving to Grieve. "Mr. Grieve, your son Tommy was curious about your work with the Manor-Sit's records. He found a letter, didn't he? One that mentioned a debt tied to the Ironwoods and this gate." Grieve's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Miss Marple turned to the vicar. "Reverend Hale, your family has a long history in Ironwood. I found a letter in the attic, signed D.H., warning of a pact and a debt. Your grandfather, perhaps. And this locket." She opened it, revealing the deed fragment. "It names a Hale, paid to keep silent about the Ironwood family's actions." Hale's face paled, and he clutched his prayer book tighter. I don't know what you mean. My family has served this village faithfully." "Have they?" Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but relentless. "The gate's curse began with Elias Ironwood, who made a pact, not with a spirit, but with a man, likely a Hale, to protect his wealth. The gate was a symbol, a warning to those who might challenge his greed, but someone betrayed that pact, and the Ironwoods vanished, leaving a trail of deaths every decade." Sir Reginald scoffed. "This is absurd. What does this have to do with Tommy or the locket?" Miss Marple's sister's eyes gleamed. "Everything, Sir Reginald. The locket holds proof of that betrayal, a deed that could ruin reputations even now. Peter Drake found it, didn't he, Clara? And he died for it. Tommy followed the same path, lured to the gate by a note." She produced the note from her bag, holding it up. "Meet me at the gate, midnight. Someone wrote this, knowing Tommy would come, and I believe that someone is here." Grieve stepped forward, his voice shaking with anger. "You sit accusing me? My son is dead, and you dare." "Not you, Mr. Grieve," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through his outburst. "But someone who knew the locket-set's secret and feared Tommy Set's curiosity. Someone who has been orchestrating this fear-curse set to keep the truth buried." A low hum filled the air, and the group froze, their eyes turning to the gate. It seemed to vibrate, its bars shimmering in the lantern light. Mrs. Morrow whimpered, but Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "A clever trick," she said. "The humming is no curse, but a mechanism, perhaps hidden in the gate's base, to frighten the superstitious. Someone has been maintaining it, ensuring the village's fear. Clara sobbed, her voice breaking. It was Father. He knew about the locket, the deed. He said it would ruin us if it came out. He told me to keep quiet, but I didn't said no. He said kill Tommy. Sir Reginald Sitt's face turned ashen, and he staggered back. Clara, you foolish girl, I did no such thing. Miss Marple Sitt's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained calm. Did you not, Sir Reginald? Or did you act to protect your family Sitt's name as the Ironwoods did centuries ago? The Gate Sitt's curse is a lie, but the deaths are real, and they point to you. The group gasped, and Sir Reginald Sitt's hand tightened on his cane. You have no proof, you meddling old woman. Miss Marple Sitt's smile was serene, but her words were steel. Not yet, Sir Reginald. But the locket, the note, and the Gate Sitt's hum are threads in a pattern, and I stop in very good at patterns. Shall we see what else the gate reveals? The hum grew louder, and the mist swirled around the gate, as if the truth itself were rising from the fog. Miss Marple stood firm, her eyes locked on Sir Reginald, knowing the final truth was close, but not quite within her grasp. Chapter 13. The Final Twist. The iron gate stood sentinel in the swirling mist, its bars glinting under the flickering lanterns as the group stood frozen, the hum resonating like a heartbeat in the night. Miss Jane Marple held the ironwood locket aloft, its gold surface catching the light as she faced Sir Reginald Vance, whose face was a mask of fury and fear. Clara's accusation hung in the air, heavy as the fog, but Miss Marple's instincts told her the pattern was not yet complete. The deaths of Peter Drake and Tommy Grieve, the stolen locket, the diary, the attic letters, and the gate's eerie hum all pointed to a truth more intricate than Sir Reginald's guilt alone. She was ready to unravel the final thread. You accuse me without evidence, Miss Marple, Sir Reginald growled, his cane trembling in his grip. This is madness. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her voice calm but unrelenting. Not madness, Sir Reginald, but clarity. The gate's curse is a fiction, a clever disguise for greed and betrayal. The locket holds a deed, proof of a pact made by Elias Ironwood in 1653, paid to a Hale to keep silent about a theft that cost lives then and now. Reverend Hale clutched his prayer book, his face ashen. My grandfather, he never spoke of such a thing. You can sit prove it. Miss Marple's smile was serene. The letters in the attic, signed J.H., beg to differ. They warn of a debt unpaid, a pact broken, and this locket. She opened it, revealing the folded deed. It names your ancestor Reverend, paid to hide Elias Ironwood's crime. But someone else knew, didn't they? Someone who used the gate's legend to kill. Clara sobbed, her hands covering her face. Father, tell her it's not true. You didn't kill Tommy. Sir Reginald Sitt's shoulders sagged, but before he could speak, Mr. Thomas Grieve stepped forward, his sharp features twisted with rage. Enough of this. You stirring up ghosts, Miss Marple, and for what? My son is dead, and you blaming everyone but the curse. Two and a Sitsters sagged. But before he could speak, Mr. Thomas Grieve stepped afore. Miss Marple Sitt's gaze turned to him, her eyes narrowing. Not everyone, Mr. Grieve. But you been very careful. Haven't you? Cataloguing the Manor 6 records, guarding the attic, dismissing Tommy Sitt's curiosity. You knew about the deed, didn't you? And you knew what Peter Drake found 10 years ago. Grieves's face paled, but he scoffed. Preposterous. I am a solicitor, not a murderer. Are you? Miss Marple said, her voice soft but piercing. Peter Drake was digging into the Ironwood papers, just as Tommy did. Both died at the gate, with no marks, no cause, except fear, amplified by that hum. A mechanism, I suspect, hidden in the gate's base, maintained by someone who needed the curse to seem real. Mrs. Morrow gasped, crossing herself. The gate sits alive. I told you, it sits cursed. No, Mrs. Morrow. Miss Marple said firmly, it's mechanical. I examined it this afternoon and found a small device, a vibrating plate, likely installed decades ago and kept in working order. It's no spirit, but a tool to terrify. And who better to maintain it than someone with access to the manor's secrets? All eyes turned to Grieve, whose hands clenched into fists. You have no proof, he hissed. Miss Marple produced the note from Tommy's pocket, holding it up. Meet me at the gate. Midnight. Written in your hand, Mr. Grieve. I compared it to your ledgers in the attic. You lured Tommy, just as you lured Peter Drake, because they found the deed, the proof that your family profited from the Ironwood's theft. Grieve staggered back, his eyes wild. You stepped wrong. You killed them, Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the mist. The Ironwood stole land and wealth, paying your ancestor to keep it quiet. The deed in the locket proves it, and you couldn't risk it surfacing. Peter found it, so you staged his death, as the curses work, using a poison that leaves no trace, perhaps from the manor's old apothecary. Tommy was next, too curious for his own good. Clurasit's eyes widened, and she turned to Grieve. You killed Peter? I thought it was father. Sir Reginald roared, stepping toward Grieve. You murdering devil! You let my daughter think I was a killer. Grieve's face contorted, and he lunged for the locket, but Miss Marple stepped back, her movements swift for her age. It's over, Mr. Grieve, she said. The constable will find the poison in your study, I'm sure, and the device in the gate will confirm your handiwork. You used the curse to hide your crimes, but the truth always comes out. Reverend Hale sank to his knees, his prayer book falling into the mud. My family, we were part of this shame. I suspected, but I never knew. Mrs. Morrow wept, but her eyes held relief. The gate sept's curse, its sept's broken. Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle. Not broken, Mrs. Morrow, but exposed. The gate was never cursed, only used to conceal greed and murder. Now, Ironwood can heal. As Grieve was restrained by Sir Reginald and the footman, Clara fell into her father Sip's arms, sobbing. Miss Marple handed the locket to Beatrice, her smile soft but triumphant. Keep this safe, Beatrice. It steps a reminder that secrets like gates can be opened with the right key. The hum of the gate faded, replaced by the quiet drip of mist. The village sit's fear, Miss Marple knew, would linger, but the truth had lifted its shadow. She looked at the gate one last time, its bars now still, and murmured, You Sip kept your secrets long enough. And so Miss Marple unravelled the mystery of the Iron Gate, revealing a truth hidden for centuries. Ironwood is free from its curse, but the echoes of its secrets will linger in the fog. What did you think of this thrilling conclusion? Did the final twist surprise you? We hope you loved the mystery. Where are you listening this from? A misty village, a cozy library, or a bustling city cafe? Drop your location in the comments and tell us your favorite moment from the story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more mysteries that will keep you guessing until the very last page. Stay curious, and we'll see you in the next adventure.